What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my fantasy football starts and sits for NFL Week 3.
Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over each position and give you my fantasy football starts and sits for NFL this week. This should help you decide who you want to start in your season-long fantasy football leagues. And we will show you how to use the Draft Dashboard tools to dominate your season-long fantasy leagues. You can find waiver wire targets, get player point projections, find the best positional matchups to see who is projected to score the most fantasy points this week. These tools will help you decide what players to start in your fantasy football leagues. We have it all right here, so let's get into it. Okay guys, let's take a look at my starts and sits for NFL Week 3. So at the quarterback position, I'm starting Cam Newton from the New England Patriots playing the Las Vegas Raiders, who have the 9th worst defense overall and they're middle of the pack defending opposing quarterbacks. Cam Newton has averaged 32.1 fantasy points per game on the season. He's averaging 13 rush attempts. He scored 39 and 26 fantasy points in the last 2 games, rushing the ball 11 and 15 times. He's projected at 19 fantasy points here in Week 3. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 53 points scored in this game, with the Patriots favored by 6. So this is a nice matchup. This guy's rushing upside is legit. So I like Cam Newton here versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Okay, and I'm going to sit Carson Wentz from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, but they've given up the 4th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Carson Wentz is only averaging 15.2 fantasy points per game on the season, only getting 1.5 rush attempts per game. He only scored 14 and 16 fantasy points in the first 2 weeks. He's projected at 17.3 fantasy points here in Week 3. Vegas thinks there's going to be 46 points scored in this game, with the Eagles favored by 6.5. So I do worry that the Eagles finally get the lead in this game and they run a lot of Miles Sanders, try to run the clock out. It's not a good matchup here for Carson Wentz. He hasn't played well so far in the season. So I'm going to sit Carson Wentz here versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. I'm going to start Jonathan Taylor from the Indianapolis Colts playing the New York Jets, who have the 10th worst defense overall, and they give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Jonathan Taylor has averaged 18.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 17.5 rush attempts per game and 4 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 51% of the snaps. He's touched the ball 57% of that time. But remember, he came in late in Week 1, so his snap percentage is probably a little bit higher, much higher in Week 2. It will be much higher in Week 3. Last week, he rushed 26 times and got 2 pass targets and scored 22 fantasy points. He's projected at 16.8 fantasy points here in Week 3. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, with the Indianapolis Colts favored by 9.5. So this is a fantastic matchup. The game script is good. The Colts should win this game, no problem. They should have the lead most of the game. Should be a running game script here. So I like Jonathan Taylor here versus the New York Jets. And I'm also going to start Miles Sanders from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Miles Sanders, he scored 21 fantasy points in his debut last week off of 20 rush attempts and 7 pass targets. He was on the field for 79% of the snaps. He touched the ball 49% of that time. He's projected at 15.1 fantasy points here in week 3. Vegas thinks there's going to be 46 points scored in this game, with the Eagles favored by 6.5. So I think this is going to be a Miles Sanders game. I'm going to sit Carson Wentz, but I'm going to start Miles Sanders here versus the Cincinnati Bengals. And one more start for you here at the running back position. Although it's not a great matchup here, I'm going to start Kareem Hunt from the Cleveland Browns playing the Washington Football Team, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they've given up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. So the matchup isn't great here, but Kareem Hunt has averaged 18.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 11.5 rush attempts per game and 4 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 43% of the snaps, touched the ball 55% of that time. He scored 24 fantasy points last week in 10 rush attempts and 2 pass targets. He's projected at 13.8 fantasy points here in week 3. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, with the Cleveland Browns favored by 6.5. So a running game script, but remember, he's involved in the passing game, and he's getting plenty of work between the rush attempts and the pass targets. So I'm not afraid of that volume. He's a productive player. So I like Kareem Hunt here versus the Washington Football Team. Okay, and at the running back position, I'm going to sit Frank Gore from the New York Jets playing the Indianapolis Colts, who have the best defense overall, and they give up the 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. Frank Gore has only averaged 4.4 fantasy points per game on the season, off of 13.5 rush attempts per game and 1 pass target per game. Now, he got 21 rush attempts last game, 2 pass targets, and only put up 6 fantasy points. So you may be tempted to start him because of the injury to Le'Veon Bell, but this is certainly not the matchup to do it. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, but they have the Jets trailing by 9.5. So it's more likely or not going to be a passing game script. So I'm going to sit Frank Gore here versus the Indianapolis Colts.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL, MLB is still going, NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. I'm going to start CeeDee Lamb from the Dallas Cowboys playing the Seattle Seahawks, who have the 4th worst defense overall, and they give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. CeeDee Lamb has averaged 15.7 fantasy points per game on the season, off of an average of 7.5 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 82% of the snaps. He's touched the ball 13% of that time. He scored 21 fantasy points last week off of 9 pass targets and 1 rush attempt. He's projected at 12.5 fantasy points here in week 3. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Dallas Cowboys trailing by 6.5. So I think it's going to be a bit more high scoring than that. And with the Cowboys trailing, this is a fantastic matchup. Should be a passing game script. So I'm going to start CeeDee Lamb here versus the Seattle Seahawks. I'm also going to start Deontay Johnson from the Pittsburgh Steelers playing the Houston Texans, who have the 8th worst defense overall, and they've been middle of the pack defending opposing wide receivers. Deontay Johnson has averaged 17 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 11.5 pass targets per game, on the field for 84% of the snaps, and he's touched the ball 21% of that time. He's projected at 12 fantasy points here in week 3. Vegas thinks there's going to be 45 points scored in this game, with the Pittsburgh Steelers favored by 5.5. So pretty decent matchup here. This guy's been getting a ton of targets, and he's been productive. So I'm going to start Deontay Johnson here versus the Houston Texans. Another start for you here, if you're really struggling at the wide receiver position, maybe because of injuries or your roster, take a look at Adam Humphries from the Tennessee Titans playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the second worst defense overall, and they give up the second most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Adam Humphries has averaged 13.3 fantasy points per game on the season, off of average of 6.5 pass targets per game. On the field for 55% of the snaps, he touches the ball 17% of that time, projected at 9.9 fantasy points here in week 3. He scored 16 fantasy points last week off of 6 pass targets. Vegas thinks there's going to be 45.5 points scored in this game, with the Tennessee Titans favored by 1.5. So we got a fantastic matchup here and a close competitive game. So I like Adam Humphries here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Okay, I'm going to sit Cole Beasley from the Buffalo Bills playing the LA Rams, who have a good defense overall, and they've given up the third fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Cole Beasley has averaged 10.9 fantasy points per game on the season, off of an average of 6.5 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 65% of the snaps, touched the ball 14% of that time. He's projected at 8.4 fantasy points here in week 3. Vegas thinks there's going to be 46 points scored in this game, with the Buffalo Bills favored by 2.5. I'm going to steer clear of Cole Beasley this week. I don't like the matchup. His upside is limited, so I'm going to sit Cole Beasley here versus the LA Rams. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. I'm going to start Mo Alie-Cox from the Indianapolis Colts playing the New York Jets, who have the 10th worst defense overall, and they give up the 12th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Mo Alie-Cox has averaged 11.6 fantasy points per game on the season, but he just got the start last week, and he scored 19 fantasy points off of 6 pass targets. So you want to look at his last week's stats because he got the start last week. He was on the field for 53% of the snaps, touched the ball 10% of that time, but that snap percentage and the touch percentage should come up now that he's the starter here. He's projected at 6.6 fantasy points here in week 3. I think that projection's a little bit low, but he did have a big game last week. But if you're struggling at the tight end position, I think this is a solid start. I like those 6 pass targets. I think they're going to go right back to him next week. He's got a pretty good matchup here. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, with the Colts favored by 9.5. So I do worry about that game script a little bit. Maybe they get ahead, they abandon the pass game, they go with the run. But if you're looking for a tight end, maybe he's still on the waiver wire. Tight ends are always hard to find. So I'm going to start Mo Alie-Cox here versus the New York Jets. Okay, now I'm going to sit Eric Ebron from the Pittsburgh Steelers playing the Houston Texans, who have the 8th worst defense overall, and they're middle of the pack defending opposing tight ends. Eric Ebron has only averaged 5.1 fantasy points per game on the season, off an average of only 3.5 pass targets per game. Now, he's been on the field for 70% of the snaps, only touched the ball 8% of the time. He's projected at 7.8 fantasy points here in week 3. Vegas thinks there's going to be 45 points scored in this game, with the Pittsburgh Steelers favored by 5.5. So the matchup isn't terrible. I'd like to see him getting more pass targets and a little bit more productive before I give him the start. So I'm going to sit Eric Ebron here versus the Houston Texans.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again and good luck.